So hello, I'm assuming you're here today because you want to learn about C++. So I'm assuming you already have a compiler ready, such as Xcode or Visual Studio. And if you don't, just go on Google, search for Visual Studio if you have Windows or Xcode if you have Mac. I think they're both free, and just download and install them. So if you already have it, let's continue. What is C++? C++ is a high-level and low-level programming language. It's a versatile programming language. It's both used for games and software development. It's a compiled programming language. This is why you need the compiler you see here. And it's also, importantly, it's an object-oriented programming language. So now that we know some of the basics of C++, let's start with the actual code. So let's start off with a preprocessor, and let's say we want to include the input, and output stream. Whoops, they're all capitalized. The input and output stream. And what this preprocessor does is that it says, okay, we want to include this input and output stream library because we're going to need it in our program or our script or whatever. And it's because in our case, we're going to use the input and output streams in our program. And you'll see what those are later. And whenever you need to include a library or include your preprocessor, you're always gonna use this hashtag or this hash or this pound or whatever you want to call it with include and with in these angle braces, whatever library you're trying to include. In this case, it's our input and output stream. So let's start off with a simple program. Well, first we're gonna have to know what functions are. So let's start off with the main function in C++. So this is the main function in C++. So if you're not familiar with functions, don't worry about that yet. We'll explain it later, and probably in a couple of videos, but it's important you just get a little bit of an idea of what functions are because they're very important. Functions, methods, they're very important in C++ programming. So as you can see, what does this int mean? It means integer. And you see people writing void main, and this does work, but it works, but it's not recommended because the standard is to use integer. People use void because maybe the program won't return a number. Well, here integer main, we have to return a number because it's an integer function, so we have to return some type of number. So in this case, we will return 0 if it's successful because the function needs some type of number to be returned to the program. So just think of a function, and this is the name of our function, which is main, followed by these braces, and inside these, and then followed by curly braces, and inside these curly braces we will put our function. We'll put the program that we want to be run. And whenever you run C++, the main function is the first function that's going to be run by C++. The main will always be the first thing. So let's start off with something very simple. So let's start off with a very simple hello world, because hello world is probably the standard of programming. So you can start off with hello world. So let's talk about console out, followed by the insertion into the stream, and then we can say hello world, and then you end it with a semicolon. And as you can see, there's an error here. But what's the problem? Well, we have to include the standard namespace. So if this all looks confusing to you, I'll explain it later. Okay, so why do we need the standard namespace, and what is this cout? And well, I guess I can understand what this hello world is. You put it inside quotation marks. And why do we need a semicolon at the end? Well, the cout, console out, tells us that we want to print out hello world onto the console. And this insertion operator tells us that, okay, we're going to insert hello world into the stream. and cout is part of the standard namespace, and because we wouldn't be able to use console out if it wasn't for the input and output stream, because cout is part of the input output stream library, which is needed for our program. So that's why we include the IO stream preprocessor. So of course, as you can see, if we took out the standard namespace and we just left cout, it would give us an error. We always need to state what the namespace is of console out is. In this case, it is the standard namespace, the standard library that we're going to be using, so we can access console out. Because if we didn't use standard, cout isn't a predefined operator, so the compiler won't know what it is. So you need to say, okay, cout console out is part of the standard. It's part of the standard namespace, and it will be using it from there. Now, you may not like to write standard all the time, followed by to. So, what if you don't like to write standard? You don't have to. You can simply do using namespace standard, and you no longer have to write standard anymore. And as you can see, there's no error. You can just write console out insertion into the stream hello world followed by semicolon, and it works. It's based on personal preference if you want to use a standard namespace here, or you just want to use using namespace standard. It's whatever you want to pick, but for the sake of simplicity, right now we're going to use using namespace standard. So if you don't see a standard, it's probably because we have a using namespace standard here. So finally, what is the semicolon at the end? Well, think of it as a sentence. Well, think back to English. English has sentences and they have periods. Think of the semicolon as the period to programming. The semicolon tells the program that you're going to end this program. It's like cout, console out, is our simple sentence, and semicolon tells the program that we're going to end our simple sentence. So then finally, if this is successful, we return 0 back to the function to tell the function that it is successful because we're returning a value. Depending on what compiler you're using, you may not need to use return 0 because it's implicit. However, I like to be explicit and just say return 0 instead of allowing the program to be implicit and forgetting some steps later and not knowing what's happening. So it's better to be explicit than having the program be implicit. Xcode, thankfully, you don't need to use return 0, but for the sake of showing you, I'm going to put return 0. So I forgot to compile my program, so I'm back, and we're going to be compiling the program. So we're going to run the program. This is on Xcode, so we're going to run it. So as you can see, build succeeded, and we get a simple hello world in our output. And that's it. So I'll see you in the next tutorial.